Hi, welcome to the Audio Engineering Podcast with me, Streaky, and
Me, Shay.
And this is episode 21. And today we're going to be discussing in the box and out of the box.
Yep.
What's good, what's bad, why, blah, blah.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry if I'm a bit echoey, but I'm in some kind of big room with no acoustics. Basically, it sounds like I'm in a drum booth or something, but unfortunately it's not that flash. Mm-hmm. So the reason why I think we should talk about in the box and out of the box is because it's expanding on something that I touched on last week when we were having our little podcast stroke discussion.
Yeah.
And I've had a few questions about it because I brought up the fact that Shay was saying about getting a box that was, something to preamp or something you were talking about.
Yeah.
And I said that you needed some good converters. So people were saying, well, is it actually worth going out or staying in? So just let's sort of unpick that a little bit. Mm-hmm. And my thing on that is starting from scratch. Whatever you're doing when you're listening to audio, you need to make sure you have a dedicated, highest quality D2A you can possibly get. The reason for that is obviously because that is the thing you're listening to everything back through. So the higher the quality of that, then the cleaner the sound's going to be and the more you're going to be able to hear. That just goes down to the basics of having a good sounding room and, and coming straight out of your computer. And just think of trying to get the best hi-fi you possibly can.
Yeah.
Sometimes hi-fi speakers aren't the best speakers to monitor on if you're mixing or recording, but then we all know that, and we all know there's different types of speakers that you can get, blah, blah, blah. But you understand what I mean. For mastering, having a really good hi-fi system actually does work really well. The B&W speakers that I use, they're major hi-fi speakers, so and a lot of people use those. So it does work in some cases. But anyway, off that tangent. So the first thing is always remember to have a good D2A, whatever. Now, if you are planning on going out of the box, if you're getting a good D2A, most good D2As for especially that are pro audio ones, a lot of them come these days with a really good A to D as well, up to a certain price point. When you start getting into sort of Prism Dreams and things like that, then you do have separate D2A converters. But for most people that are recording, you can get really good D2As for a couple of £1,000 that have got an A to D in them as well. The smaller Prism stuff's good, Antelope, blah, blah, blah. So really, going into what I was saying, ideally you would have that anyway, a really good A to D and a really good D2A. So because of that, you'll be listening to something really well. And when you're recording in, you'll be able to record in with a really good A to D. Mm-hmm. But that's something that everyone doesn't think about. A lot of people will go straight and buy the cheapest D2A they can find, where really that's not the point. You need to be getting the best quality you can get. It's probably more important to get that than anything else, most things. That's probably should be number one or number two on your list after good monitors. But, no point in having good monitors if you can't hear properly, really. And that comes down to having good converters. And a lot of the good converters have then got a good clock in them. So if you are using outboard digital stuff, or if you're using Pro Tools or whatever, you're not running off the internal clock from the Mac. You're running from the clock from the sound card or sound unit. So now going on to what's better, whether it's better to be in the box or out of the box. Now, for mastering, it's better to be out of the box because you're using high-end precision stuff that gives you a thicker sound, not a thicker sound, a more 3D sound than you are, and you're not using as many bits of equipment. So you don't, when it comes to recall, you don't need to recall as many bits of equipment, and a lot of the high-end mastering equipment is notched. So you can actually get things sounding exactly the same as you could, on the last pass or whatever. Yeah. That obviously does have its downfalls that you have to set your gear up all the time. But so you're not setting up as many bits of equipment as you would if you were coming out into a massive mixing console, aka the 1980s and 90s. Going on from what Shay was saying, it's nice to have a little chain and to have some stuff if you're in recording, but you can expand on that one.
Yeah, I mean, I like to be as much in the box as possible, just because I don't like the fact of having to rely on recalling certain bits of gear. Like when it comes to mixing, I'm talking about. Like for mixing, you rarely get a notched piece of gear or a stepped attenuator in a everyday compressor outboard or EQ outboard. So recall is a nightmare. And I mean, I've used mixing desks before, and I love using mixing desks. I think they're really nice to use. But again, when it boils down to it, the fact is it's a faff. Like I can't be bothered. I know it sounds bad to say it, but I'd prefer to just be in the box for the ease of use of it. And nowadays with plugins, like I always go on about it, the Slate stuff, the UAD stuff, the FabFilter stuff, you don't need outboard gear anymore. Like no one listens to a record anymore, and straight away they go, oh, I love that LA2A they've got on the vocal. No one knows. No one cares. Does it sound good or not? No one cares that you've spent 50 grand on outboard gear to mix the track. Does it sound okay? You could spend 50 grand on outboard gear and it sounds rubbish. Or you could just use stock plugins, know how to use them properly, and get an amazing mix.
I think also you're bringing in a lot of noise. When you're not in a really, really high-end studio, you're bringing in a load of noise and a load of unwanted cheapness that you can get away with without. Yeah. So the kind of trade-off between having original analog equipment and having in the box stuff is, you know, there's a lot of cables, there's a lot of setup, but there's also a lot of noise going on. So that's a big trade-off. I know nearly every mix engineer I work with is in the box these days.
Yeah.
I mean, they may sum out. I mean, do you sum out into something?
I mean, yeah. Well, I did. I don't anymore. I used to sum out all the time. I used to sum out into like a little summing, like a mixer. I used to have a summing mixer, and all I would do is just sum out into that just to get some separation. But the difference in sound was so minuscule that me and a couple of other people that are well into audio could just about tell the difference. The average person that's listening to music cannot tell the difference. As long as it was mixed okay within the DAW and it was panned correctly and you had a good stereo width going already, you didn't necessarily need that separation. Like, I mean, even for recording nowadays, beforehand I was a firm believer you had to have a lot of outboard gear to record vocal. You needed to have a nice preamp, you needed to have it going through an EQ, going through a compressor, so you recorded a good sound. Whereas nowadays, and a lot of people will disagree with this, nowadays you can get something like a UAD Apollo or the Antelope interfaces where you can record through modelled plugins of things with little to no latency and get a sound as good as, if not better, than using outboard gear. I mean, I don't...
Now, do you get the three, you know, with mastering, I've done a few comparisons on my YouTube channel where I've had the original piece of equipment and I've done comparisons, and there's always a difference. There's always a kind of depth of sound and warmth and stuff, and that's obviously coming if you are using like an original Pultec or something. Surely that's going to make a bigger difference to a vocal than a plug-in Pultec.
Well, no.
If you're in the perfect scenario of having nice leads and nice A to Ds, D to As.
Well, you could have the best conversion, the best shortest amount of leads, the best interfaces, the best mixing desk, and 4 Pultec EQs. All 4 of those are going to sound different. Whereas you could have one Pultec plugin, like when you're testing out and like comparing hardware to software, like a hardware to the plugin emulation. There's no point. I mean, I don't really see the point in comparing the two unless you've got the hardware that the software was modelled off.
Yeah, no, fair point.
Do you see what I mean? Like, I mean, people like Chris Lord Alge, he's got racks and racks of 1176s, and they all serve a purpose because they all sound different. They're the same compressor. And some of them are exactly the same revision. Like, he'll have the same revision, but 4 of them, and they all sound completely different because of age.
It's interesting because there's Howie Weinberg in America was saying that his Studer, when he's matched it against the one, because it was modelled for
the Slate ones,
the Slate one, because they're in the same building, and he was saying that it's so identical, there's no point in using his old machine anymore.
Exactly, because it was modelled off that one. But then you could take, like the tape machine you used to have, you could take that and then listen up against it. It's still a Studer, but it's not going to sound the same. But it could be literally down to the fact that how old the components are, the soldering that's gone on, how old it is, how much tape's been run through it. There's so many different factors that you could have the same piece of gear, which is why now, for ease of use and for not just recallability, but for efficiency, in the box is where it's at. I mean, as far as producing, it's a different story. When you're thinking about sound creation, I'm a firm believer in sort of outboard synthesizers just because it's that hands-on thing for creativity. where you're actually feeling a sound and you put yourself into a sound.
Yeah,
you're
also
touching
like a Moog synth sounds has got a vibe to it, isn't it?
Yeah.
Obviously, they all sound different, but they do have a certain feel, and the filters are incredible.
Yeah, I mean, I love soft synthesizers. I mean, I started with, obviously, I didn't start with analog synths. I started with software synthesizers. But you could have like a real Moog and a modeled Moog plugin. You could pretty much get the same kind of sounds out of it. But the fact that you're physically touching the Moog, an analog Moog, you're going to do completely different stuff to what you would do sitting there clicking a mouse and moving one thing at a time when you've got two hands. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, in the same way that because I'm a bit old school, when I used to mix stuff on a mixing desk, like riding the faders was always a joy, and you'd get loads of happy accidents from doing sort of delay and reverb tails and things like that. Mm-hmm. You'd come out with loads of new stuff when you're producing stuff that way. Yeah, that was always a real good artistic way of working.
But it's a catch-22 thing. I mean, it's pros and cons. You can get amazing fader rides, and you can get all this extra like goodness out of using an analog mixing desk. But then, what if 2 minutes before the end you completely fluff up one of the faders? You've got to do the whole thing again. You can't just go back. You can't just go, oh, we'll cut it there and we'll copy and paste that. No, you can't. You've got to do the whole thing all over again. Like when I used to use a mixing desk for mixes, and I'd come out of Logic or Pro Tools and then through every single channel of the mixing desk and do all my levels, pans, EQs. I'd use outboard compressor on a bus for like parallel compression, and I loved it. It was amazing. But then when it came back to say, yeah, this is really good, but could you just lift the snare slightly? I was like, right, okay, I've done 4 mixes since then, so I've got to recall all the desk. I'm spending an hour, then I'm listening back to get it just perfect to how it was before, to then make the slightest tweak on something where if it was all in the box, which now I could have got just as good a sound, if it was all in the box, it's a 3-second job. You open the session, you lift the snare a little bit, sorted. So like.
When are you going out of the box just purely for sound creation and recording, which is sound creation basically?
Well, yeah, I mean, obviously for recording, if I'm using a microphone, it's an analog mic, but straight away the mic goes straight into the UAD Apollo, and I use all of the hardware emulations from the Apollo. Whereas I used to use an outboard EQ, an outboard compressor. I don't use that anymore. I just use the Apollo's unison and plug-in technology. Then synthesizers, I've got 2 analog synths, but they're really just the sound design.
What's the D2A and what's the AT and things like that on an Apollo? Are they any good?
Lovely. Like I was honestly blown away by how good they sound for the price range. Like my interface, I think it's about 1,600 for 8 inputs. So you've got 4 mic inputs, and it's like 8 inputs in total basically, and extra line inputs. And same with outputs, you've got 8 outs, and it is like night and day compared to what I was using before. I had first of all a Focusrite Sapphire Pro 40, which I thought sounded really good. Then the ZR16 mixing desk, which was my audio interface at the time, which had sort of rave reviews on Gear Sluts and all that. So I went for it, and actually sounded pretty good. But then the Apollo is just the next level. It's open, wide, 3D sounding, and just clean. So I don't feel like I need... Like I want it to be as clean as possible, so anything that I do put on, that's the only sound I'm going to be putting onto it. Like I'm not adding any extra unwanted analoginess, like you say, that the noise that you get from analog gear, the noise that I would get from my mixer at the time, I was like, oh, it's analog, like it's amazing, but it was noise. I don't want noise. If I wanted noise,
yeah, sometimes the noise can be good, but a lot of if you've got too much of it, then it's just getting in the way of the sound, and then that's when it's an issue.
Yeah. But when it comes to like producing stuff, I love outboard because you can touch things and it's the creative side. But when it comes to mixing a track and you've gone past that creative production side of things, in the box all day. Like you say, I was saying the only time I come out of the box now at a mixing stage is to go through the compressor that I built, and it's not even compressing anything. It's just going through tubes
just
and a VCA.
For the sound.
Yeah, it's just going through a bit of analog gear. And even then, sometimes, even though it's not a recallable problem because I literally turn it on, leave it for 10 minutes, and then it's what it sounded like before, it's not necessary. It's just a lot of the time I have it in and I just have to bypass it because I've already got my warmth that I wanted from the Slate plugins or from the mix balance that I've done or from the sound design from the synths that I'd used. So I don't feel like I need that warmth anymore. And I don't think anyone really does, except when you get to mastering, where you are sort of reliant on that outboard chain.
Well, mastering it, it's like I've tried to master in the box and it just doesn't work. You just can't. It sounds cheap. It sounds thin because my ears are so used to hearing analog equipment.
Yeah.
That if I listen to a plugin, and I'd love to use plugins. My ideal scenario is a slate desk in front of me with 2 speakers,
What, the MCI
and that's it.
Raven?
That would be amazing. Just a Raven in front of me, ultra modern studio, amazing speakers, just the desk, nothing else in the room. That's my ideal scenario, but that's so way off because at the moment there's just no way that I can get a sound that's anywhere close to what I can get with analog equipment.
Okay.
And there's just a depth, there's a warmth, there's going through cables, there's going through, different D2As and testing stuff out. It's just another world compared to using plugins. I've really tried because I really would love to. I've tried FabFilter, multiband. Mm-hmm. It sounds great when you're doing it. It really does. And you get really into it and you start getting it all sounding good. And then I do the same thing to test myself on the real gear. And then it's like, well, it depresses me because I'm like, oh no, I need to always have, because I really want plugins to do what they say, but they just don't.
See, I'd love for sort of UAD to do a Sontec EQ and for UAD to model the Maselect gear. And then I honestly believe if you just literally got yourself a Raven, use the Slate plugins and some UAD mastering emulations, I could honestly say I reckon you'd get that sound. And just literally come out of that Summit box.
It goes back also to what you were saying earlier on. I've developed my sound through the equipment that I've bought.
Yeah.
So my sound, I know my Neumann 1980s Neumann compressor. Yeah. I know how that sounds exactly, right? Yeah. Now, if someone was to tweak that in any way, or if I use someone else's, I wouldn't be able to get the sound that I get because I'm so used to that. And that goes back to what you're saying, that every bit of kit sounds different.
Yeah.
And so I know how the EQ, my Maselec EQ sounds.
Yeah.
Now, they all sound different as well. Every single version of those sounds different. Mm-hmm. So you kind of, as you're playing, and that's why it takes you, when you go to a new room, it takes you a while to get your head back into the stuff, especially if you're using someone else's kit.
Yeah.
It's very hard to get your sound back. So as a mastering engineer, it takes you about 6 months just to find your groove again and find the sound and find your little lineup because you've got certain kit you put in certain areas. Mm-hmm. And that definitely goes back to the kind of feel thing of analog and the sound that you can achieve. And this always goes before that because I know that's how I get my sound. Yeah. And that's really, that's the analog for me, where I don't think you have that for mixing because you have so many components to deal with all of the time and the tracks, you're just doing different things all the time on everything that, I don't know, I'm not a mix engineer, but that's what I guess. Mm-hmm. I'm sure that certain things, if you're going out of the box, then you'll have certain compressors, like you say, you've got a compressor you like because it's that certain sound.
Yeah. But I mean, going out of the box now in terms of mixing, beforehand, it was you just do it. You didn't think about it. You just did it. Now I seriously have to think about it. Like, oh, can I be bothered to do this? I'll search about for a plugin that I know I can get kind of the same sort of thing and just use that rather than be like, oh, can I be bothered? And I know it sounds bad and probably unprofessional to do it, but I feel all I'm going to do is hinder myself by taking up the time to get an analog piece of gear working properly. How I want it to work when I know a plugin's going to be just fine. Now, this is a lot different to, say, 15 years ago or like 10 years ago when plugins were nothing like they are now. Like there was no... like there's
no, but also that goes back to exactly what I'm saying, where you get used to the sound of that plugin.
Yeah.
And everyone's getting used to the same plugin because it's all modelled on the same bit of kit.
Yeah.
And I think that's where you get mastering engineers who get a different sound to other people.
Yeah.
And when it comes to mixing, if you were to set up a bit of equipment, you'd still go, I'm just not feeling it. I'd rather go back to the plugin because I know the sound of the plugin. And that goes back to what I'm saying is you get that feeling inside of, that's right now.
Yeah, because you're used to the gear.
As you're doing it, you're like, the vocal now sounds right to me. That's how I like doing vocals.
Yeah.
My little vocal chain I mix to on a vocal is this, and this, because that's the sound I like in my head. for a vocal.
It's like when
That's the difference between engineers, isn't it?
Yeah, well, like when I started, it was I needed analog gear. In my head, I needed all kinds of analog gear. I bought 3 Alesis 3630s.
Is that to show off though? You might as well be buying blank front panel.
So I mean, for one, yeah, it looked good, but for me, it was like I thought that was the key. The analog gear was the key. I thought that all the gear, like, how can I get a good mix if I haven't got the gear? Looking at other people's studios online and that, and thinking, well, Daft Punk's tunes sound so sick. Why? Study it. Okay, they use this compressor. It's got to be that. So I bought 3 of them, proper cheap. All of them sounded completely different. But then after about a month of using them religiously, I realised it's not that at all. Like, it's not the compressor that's made the sound so good. It was the people that were using it that made the compressor sound good. The
way they're using it, they're using it as an instrument.
Yeah, exactly.
So the way they're using it, the way they hear it, the way that they push that into stuff, and the way that they then use other bits of equipment in tandem with it, and blah blah.
Like, all my analog gear for processing, not for creation or sound creation or anything, like the processing, EQs, compressors, limiters, things like that, is gone. That nothing, unless I made it, I don't have it anymore. And the only reason I keep the ones I made is because I feel like I can't physically throw them away because they're like children.
No one wants to buy them.
True, yeah. Well, yeah, it's true. Like, no one's going to buy it. No one, no one's going to go out their way to buy a one-off thing that I've made. Like, who am I? So yeah, I'm looking at my rack now. I've got an audio interface, the Apollo. I've got a limiter underneath it, which hasn't been turned on for about 2 years. And I've got the compressor underneath, which, like I said, is the Valve VCA thing that I just run through sometimes. Yeah. And the rest of it is all in the box because of the goodness of plugins. Like, honestly, I don't know, we'll never agree on it, but...
but I think I think through this conversation, I think we've hit the nail on the head of it's all about what you get used to then develop your sound. So they become your instrument. Yeah. And so you're playing your instrument every day. You're learning that instrument and you're getting good at it. And so that's what's giving you your sound. So once everyone's got used to being in the box, which they're starting to because of the ease of use, that's the kind of gateway in.
Yeah.
And then they're getting used to the sound and going, well, I've got my sound now. Why do I want to then start going out again and finding another bit of equipment that I've got to learn again just for the fact that it's analog?
Exactly.
It's like, there's no point. I can work this bit of equipment to get the sound that I like. And, and I guess that a lot of mixes that are coming out these days, people listening to music have got used to that sound. If you listen to an old record, it sounds old for a reason because it was used on certain equipment that everybody in the country got used to hearing and got used to knowing that's how that sounds, that's how music sounds. For instance, you can't not put a limiter across track anymore because it doesn't matter if someone wants something at minus 14, whatever, right? It's just, the fact is you're still going to have to limit it, but you'll bring the level down because otherwise it doesn't sound like a modern record.
Exactly, yeah.
Everyone's got used to an L2 sound. People don't realise it, but they have.
Yeah.
People are getting more used to a Fab Filter sound because everyone's using that. It's just the way it is. But if you don't use it, you don't get that sound.
True, but then the thing is, talking about in the box and out the box, people have got used to the sound of a limited track, but people haven't got used to the sound of a hardware limited track. They don't know. Do you know what I mean? It's like you could, or like the compression characteristic, like it sounds thick.
Yeah, but they have to. No, that's not true because there's no hardware limiter that will get you loud enough.
True.
So there's no way that you could even use a hardware limiter now for the same kind of, because you can go into an A to D, you still need to get 6 dB more on the way out afterwards.
True. Well, so instead of
it's not like the olden days where if I was using a master limiter, I could get away with using that on the track and then not using a digital limiter.
Yeah.
And it was a totally different sound, but a very 90s sound.
Yeah.
But you can't do that now. You haven't been able to do that for 20 years.
But like in terms of
you have to be slamming it.
Like going through the gear, like the sound that you get from just gear, I believe, and I know this, it works. You can fake an analog warmth. It's not a hard thing to do, especially again now with like plugins and stuff. Things like saturation plugins, tape emulation plugins, really nice compressor plugins. You can fake, even just with EQ, with like a little band in the mids in the EQ, you can make it sound warmer. Like that you don't. I think what I'm trying to say is you used to have to go out the box. There was no question.
Is
You
this
had to go out
mastering,
the box.
or is you talking mastering or mixing?
I'm talking both, mixing and mastering. That you used to
Well, I
have
don't
to.
believe you. I don't believe you on mastering.
You don't need. You don't need. I mean, it's not a necessity. But like I said, we'll never agree on it. Like it's not. It's not a necessity. It's nice to have analog gear on the output. I believe.
No, it's not. That's that's totally not the point. I think that you're not. The whole point of going out of the box for mastering is that you are getting a depth, and you are getting a different. You're making the music have a totally sort of 3D effect that you cannot get with plugins. You just literally cannot get it.
Okay.
I don't care what you say.
Fine.
You can't EQ. You can't EQ on a plugin and have it sounding as good as even just going in and out of converters with I don't know, say a Sontec, run through a Sontec and then back in, and use a little bit of EQ, or run through a Maselec. You just won't get the same. There's no way you'll get the same sound. Now it's very slight. But mastering is all about that.
True, but then I mean, say you're going through that Sontec to get the sound of it. You could go through the
mastering's all about the little bits adding up to the whole.
Yeah.
So you haven't got a lot to play with by the time you come to mastering, which is why when you do 1 dB, it makes the same amount of difference as 10 dB further, before the chain.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. I mean, I wouldn't just be able to use the Logic EQ and get the same sound as a Sontec. It's not happening. But I could use the Logic EQ and then maybe a saturation plugin and just slightly, maybe an overdrive little bit of a plugin with a tiny little bit of drive. Like there's ways around it to fake it.
Yeah, but your high end won't sound anywhere near as clean and as shaped.
Yeah.
With a plugin EQ as it will do running through whatever saturation and whatever other nonsense you're putting across it. It's you're never going to get the same high end. You're never going to get the same. You're never going to get the same warmth in the low end and the tightness in the kick and stuff. Never ever. I'd love to be able to do it, but you can't. Not at the moment. You will be able to, but not at the moment.
Well, soon. I reckon in 5 years' time you'll be able to just press a button. Look at Lander now. Do you know what I mean? Like that sort of thing.
Well, that's a whole different podcast. But
I know,
Lander will be probably good in 10 years' time, I guess.
Yeah. Well,
I would say. I mean, there's no reason why it wouldn't be. I mean, this is another whole podcast, and I have done a video on it.
Yeah.
But it's never going to replace a human. It's a bespoke suit versus an off-the-shelf
exactly.
suit.
I mean, Lander is literally as in the box as you could possibly get because it's so detached
doesn't get
from
more in the box
human. Yeah, it's so detached from like human contact at all.
Yeah.
But but I mean that's something we do.
It will always get a result, whether you like that result or not. It's totally different, and you're never going to get a personalised result. You're never going to, with Lander, it's always going to do something. It'll get, it's a whole market. It opens up a whole different market to mastering. So I'm quite happy about that.
Yeah.
I mean, before it was like when I started, there was probably 10 studios that did mastering. Yeah. So, now there's 500 blokes for the computer doing it.
Yeah, exactly. A waves crack and a laptop.
Yeah, and probably 50 decent mastering studios, and then another million people going through Lander or whatever, thinking that that's doing them a favour. So,
but I suppose it only does.
It's a different world.
It only does your brand and business a good thing because people can see the difference between actually having a person that uses gear and knows how to use the gear, rather than just uploading it to some code and then
but like I say, I think that's just exactly this. I just think that's a connoisseur. It's the same as a suit. Do you care that your suit was made in China and it was cut on a machine and sewn up by a robot?
Yeah.
You haven't even thought about your suit that you're wearing.
Yeah,
do you know what I mean? Because you're not into suits.
Yeah.
You don't give a shit. You just go, okay, I need a suit. You haven't thought about the process and whether it looks good. To somebody who is really into suits and into wearing bespoke suits and knows their stuff and they're a tailor and they're up for it and they're loving it. They look at your Marks and Spencer's suit and go, really? You think that's a good suit?
Yeah.
It's a similar thing, and that will always be the way. There's always going to be somebody that's a real audiophile that just wants to go to this guy because he uses this certain equipment and they like the style of that equipment. And then there's going to be a load of people that go, to be honest, I don't really care. I just need it mastered. Bang, £2. It's fine.
Yeah.
horses for courses. You know, if it's going to it'll get better and better, but it's never going to be the same.
It'll never be the same as a person physically sat down touching something. It's never, because then you're putting your stamp on it.
Yeah. Okay, so we've got to wrap up because
Yes.
Shay's very busy.
Yeah,
And
really.
I'm hanging out in this room and I'm about to get told off any minute. So, but thanks for listening. I hope you got something out of today's ramble from Shay and I. I think we hit on a few juicy little tidbits, hopefully.
Yeah. I'm going to go and turn my compressor off now.
Yeah, for once in his life. And please subscribe to my channel and Shay's channel on YouTube, and go to iTunes and subscribe to this podcast. I'll leave everything in the show notes in the description at the bottom on iTunes and on YouTube, wherever you're picking this up from. Please subscribe and please leave us a review on iTunes. That'd be great. And if you've got any questions, put them in the comments, because we're always up for answering and talking more nonsense on whatever you need to know. So thanks for listening.